This is Louisa Wilcox at Grizzly Times, where we speak for the grizzly bear and the wild places it calls home. The grizzly has long captured our imagination as a symbol of wilderness in the American West, but it's still vulnerable and needs our help. Our podcast introduces you to fascinating people, scientists, business people, advocates, artists, and others who share their experience and insights about grizzly bears and their ecosystems. You can also find us at grizzlytimes.org, and we hope you will join us in helping the threatened grizzly flourish in our rapidly changing world.
Well, this is Louisa Wilcox with Grizzly Times, and I am delighted to be here today with Gay Bradshaw. Dr. Gay Bradshaw is a psychologist, ecologist, and pioneer researcher on animal trauma and wildlife self-determination. Her work with elephants, parrots, apes, and a slew of other species led her to found the field of transspecies psychology. Gay's latest book, Talking with Bears, Conversations with Charlie Russell, is about the rancher, filmmaker, and acclaimed writer who has challenged our way of thinking about and relating to wild animals, especially grizzly bears. And I should confess up front here, too, that Charlie Russell was a good friend of mine and my husband, David, and we were both deeply moved by how beautifully Gay captured Charlie's life and passion. And so thanks for being here today, Gay.
No, thank you.
Your recent book, Talking with Bears, Conversations with Charlie Russell, builds on your significant body of work on how human-induced trauma in wild animals can harm them. And before we dive into the grizzly bear world, maybe you can share about how you got into this work and the damage you've seen, say, for example, in elephants or parrots or chimpanzees.
Yes, I would say that my quote-unquote professional life or work with animals and animal minds began when I was really at a point. I'd been working for the government as a research mathematician, and I really came to a point where, which is no surprise, where the real problem was not the environment. It was actually people, humans, and understanding them and their psychology and what really lay behind the destruction and the damage which is being done and has been done. And so I began to go into psychology, and I had recently gotten back from Africa. It was my first trip to Africa, and I heard about it. It was a National Science Foundation project, and I was invited as someone who did modeling and landscape ecology to look at what the effects of this sort of massive translocation, relocation of African lions was going to be, what those effects were, because South Africa was just moving from apartheid and was opening up to ecotourism. So a lot of the reserves, national and provincial parks, were importing lions and also elephants, all sorts of the big five, to fill their lands that had become depauperate with those species as attractions for tourists. And so, anyways, initially that was there because all these lions were being brought in, and it was kind of a large-scale project where it was saying, like, wow, we're looking at lions and lion dynamics at this landscape level, what's going on. And at that time, just like it was the third day into the trip, this park ranger told me the story of these elephants. And at the time, I was even more naive. I just didn't really understand the significance, but that they were finding all these dead rhinos, white rhinoceroses and black rhinoceroses, which were both and are still endangered. And at first they thought it was poachers, etc. But over a space of time, and it was over like a decade, over 100 had been killed. And they came across the suspects. The suspects and the perpetrators as such were young male elephants, which was shocking. It was unprecedented. And it was a real puzzle. That became a puzzle for me and the subject of my dissertation. So I was coming to the elephant situation, with the psychological, with a neuropsychological eye, which is different from a behavioral perspective. And what really came out, it just really fell out when I looked at the biographies of these young male elephants, that they had suffered a series of what I came to call traumas, psychological and physiological traumas. So these young elephants had witnessed in the 80s, had witnessed their they had a helicopter cull. So they witnessed their mother being killed, their family being killed in this horrific, you can imagine being shot from the air. Then they were infants, and they were, prematurely weaned, and they were translocated to places in these different parks when they were babies. And they were without the normal social structure, et cetera, and in foreign areas. It was South Africa, but every place is very different and everything, so they had to fend on their own. And not only that, they did not have family structure, and then these young males were not part of, as they matured, did not have exposure and invitation to join an all-male bull group or area. So in sort of classical terms, elephants have these two main phases of socialization, which are the natal family being with mommy and the aunties and siblings, and then the young males are either kicked out or they leave in their teens and they go off to be with older male elephants, and they're with them for like at least 15 years until they go and become sexually mature, which is in their 30s. So these young bulls were the perpetrators. They were coming into must early, like in their teens, prematurely, and they were sexually assaulting and killing rhinoceroses. And that was, I think, the first thing was caught by I think they saw the footprints, but I think it was a tourist actually who got this on film. So anyways, I was not trained in animal behavior. My background was not in biology. I'd been exposed to it. So I looked through the lens of neuropsychology, and that's when I discovered that science runs on, and this leads into what you mentioned, transspecies psychology. The biomedical sciences, and pretty much all of science, implicitly runs on a unitary model of brain, mind, and behavior for all animals. And animal models, which is using rats, cats, you name it, in labs to probe human and animal to human minds and bodies, is the standard. However, making inference from animals to humans was okay, has been okay, and it still is, but going from humans to animals was not. And when I looked at the work, and given my background, it just didn't make sense, so I contacted a couple of poobahs in the areas of neuroscience, and I said, I'm looking at these elephants, and I'm seeing the symptoms, and making inference from humans to animals. Is that done? And one famous Stanford professor said, yes, you're correct, but it's not done. So I was later to learn what that meant of it's not done. We can get into that later. So essentially, I ended up, doing a study on this, talking to different people in India as well, finding out that there was some similar symptomology, et cetera, and that they conform to the classic symptoms and the criteria for post-traumatic stress disorder, and essentially complex post-traumatic stress disorder, which includes relational trauma and a series of trauma which these individuals had experienced. So I named this field called transspecies psychology, not to start any field. It was mainly to bring attention to the fact that this is the way science is. Science is cookie cuts out this bidirectional inference. And so transspecies psychology, as I said, it was not meant to start a new field, but to name what the corpus of science really said, and that is that elephant brains, bear brains, human brains, cat brains, and even octopus, later in 2012, neuroscientists in Cambridge said, they came out with this manifesto saying all animals, including invertebrates such as the octopus, have the same neural substrates. In other words, they've got the same brains and processes that we do, which gives us the capacity for thinking, feeling, and consciousness.
Mm-hmm. And should give us a little humility about our role in things.
I'm sorry, I didn't hear that.
I said, and should give us a little humility about our role relative to other species.
Yeah, and as you said, it was, and again, from a personal perspective of, why did I end up going in to get a second PhD? That was certainly not my intention. However, and I wasn't conscious of it. Now I can put a name on it. I was really trying to find collective language, in this case science, which would describe my own personal experiences that I've had throughout my life.
Well, Gay, let's get into Charlie. To me, you might appear as kind of an odd couple. I mean, you're such a well-published scholar and a public persona, while Charlie was a shy woodsman who didn't finish high school. How did your paths cross, and what kind of connection did you have?
I can't quite remember who it was, but someone said to Charlie, or someone said to me, you should talk to each other. I think his book Grizzly Heart came out about the same time that mine, Elephants on the Edge, came out. So anyway, somehow we were given each other's phone numbers, and I don't think either of us, were particularly interested in each other, but we followed up on it. And we just started talking, and we had another conversation and another conversation. And what was Charlie's frustration, of course, and his motivation for spending time talking to me is that what I wrote about in terms of animal psychology and trauma, in other words, that the effects of human violence on animals, which includes bears, grizzly bears, resonated with his own experience. And he had been very frustrated because in our society, generally speaking, your ideas are not validated and are not considered to be valid unless you are degreed, unless you have some kind of, master's, PhD, or some kind of collectively sanctioned authority in that way. And Charlie was a very sensitive person, and when he saw the, year after year, both the ranching and in the quote-unquote management and agencies, biology, that were essentially exacerbating the issues with bears, plus his own personal deep, disturbing feelings about seeing such violence and misperception being imposed on these wonderful beings. Anyways, he was appreciated that, I've got the degrees. I basically, what I said to him was, the things that you're observing, that you've experienced with bears, are what the neurosciences and neuropsychology, what science would predict. So it was consistent. So my quote-unquote, in other words, not mine, science, would predict exactly what Charlie observed. We both had a commitment to truth, and I would say an allergy to mistruth, particularly in the cases when it was so harmful. In this case, we're talking about bears and other wildlife. So we were both really committed to the truth, and that was something that was, that I think really was the glue, that kept us together. And I would say it was love. I grew to love Charlie. I don't know if he loved me or not, but I think it was love in the sense of that the bear world love. It has to do with, when he was with bears, and this is my experience with other animals, the substrate of existence is really love. So I would say that, Charlie and I shared deep commitment to truth and a deep appreciation for love, which we felt that nature is really made of, or that is the substrate of nature. So now I'll
Charlie
go on.
Charlie wrote a lot about love in his various books, and love of being of the connection with bears, love, bear love, as you suggested, and also joy, just the joy of being in the presence of these animals.
And curiosity. Mm-hmm. And that something was, I'll give you another personal comment. My experience with Charlie, which extended, almost 10 years, conversations twice a week or more, he was just such a loving person. And he was just a loving person. I'm not trying to say to me, I'm just saying he was just he emanated love and care. And so in that way, he very much resonated with what he quote unquote studied, which he did not. You say, I understand bears, I don't study them, but he resonated and reflected the love that nature nature provides.
In your book, you described the love that Charlie had for this particular bear, Brandy, and maybe you could read a passage that gets to his connection with her.
Okay. This is from the preface. A female brown bear is standing on a grassy bench, looking down at a patchwork of snow and turf. Her nose lifts as the wind passes. The air carries the sweetness of blossoms and the quiet growl of a snowmelt river. It is summer in Kamchatka, Russia's far eastern peninsula. For 7 months, the land has rested in frozen slumber. Now, with the season's warmth, life bursts into a raucous cavalcade of color. Streams choked with crimson salmon, meadows laughing green, and stark sky beaming blue. It is bear time, time to glean every calorie possible in preparation for the coming winter. The subject of the bear's gaze is a man with tousled gray hair and welly boots. He is sitting on a pocket of grass nestled between the arms of a snowbank. 2 bear cubs are playing near him. Without shifting her gaze, the bear begins to walk slowly toward the man and cubs. There is intention in her pace. Suddenly, an explosion of life disrupts the tranquility. The cubs have caught sight of their mother. They run joyously toward her, their faces open with broad, toothy smiles. The adults, man and bear, exchange silent greetings in the space above the chaos of rambunctious youth. Cub-minding duties finish for the day. The man rises and tucks his camera back into its case. As he leaves, he glances back at the mother and child reunion. The female, who would come to be known as Brandy, is lying on her back with her cubs nursing eagerly. Walking stick in hand, the man heads for home. It's been a grand day.
Thank you. Well, Charlie spoke a lot about mutual relations with wild animals as defined by respect, humility, attentiveness, and what he called fitting in. Maybe you could explain more about this and how his views might relate to your own.
Fitting in was a term that Charlie used, and it was really a principle of his philosophy and his ethos. And what it meant is, and he describes it, when he grows up in various situations and when he's in Kamchatka, in a sense it's antithetical to the attitude and I would say the philosophy of modern humanity. What it is that it's becoming part, it's not standing out, it's becoming part of where you are. So it's, for example, it's the idea of, and others have phrased it this way, it's the idea of, if you come to someone's house, let's say you're driving in the country and you see a house, and for some reason you want to go talk to that person. Well, depending on which culture you come from, you go down the driveway, and you wait a little bit. Some cultures, people wait in the car until the other person comes out, the house owner comes out, or just in any case, you go up and you knock on the door. You don't just walk on in and then go to the fridge and take out a sandwich and have a beer and ignore everyone that's around you. And that really describes how our culture acts in nature and how management, quote unquote, I don't like to use that word, but for lack of a better term, and wildlife biologists in these capacities, and I would say even conservation research, it's very presumptuous. It presumes human primacy, that our objectives, our needs come well before and are justified before anyone else, meaning bears or any other animal. So that's a kind of a rough description. But when you read through the book and you listen to Charlie's details, fitting in is also a metaphysical. It's a metaphysical type of description as well. It's a very different mode of being. It's more in a listening mode. It's not necessarily having an agenda. It's a listening mode. It's a watching mode. It's becoming part of the landscape. And I think that we sense that when we have a yearning to go to nature. Well, if someone is unhappy, or they've had trauma, or if they just want to relax. In general, most people go to nature, or they look at they play the ocean on their internet or something like that. But nature is very soothing and healing, and that is really because everyone fits in. There's a coherence, so there's a fundamental coherence, and so for Charlie, fitting in was learning how, and it takes some time. It takes listening. Like when he was Kamchatka, he had to learn how to fit into Kamchatka in that particular Kamalnoya basin. It's all very specific. And he had to learn how to fit in specifically there, and he made a real effort to do that in many ways. The way he designed, the way he put his cabin, the way he walked, when he did things, when he didn't do things, etc.
Mm-hmm. Well, Charlie certainly did some unconventional things with grizzlies. Some were very practical in terms of when he was on his ranch in Alberta, he fed in the spring dead cows to grizzlies to keep them from eating his calves, and they left his livestock alone, the bears did. But other things that Charlie did were seen as radical, especially the forging of these intimate relationships with grizzlies at such close distances that many managers and even other scientists freaked out. And I assume that you and Charlie had a lot to say to each other on this topic of connection, of the profound, deep connection to wild animals.
Well, for example, when you were talking about the cows, that's a very logical thing. See, mm-hmm. Charlie spent a lot of time understanding, learning about grizzly ways and culture, and all the bison were gone. They were driven out by the farmers and the ranchers, and any biologist, would look at it and say, oh, you've changed their habitat. They don't have the resources that they need, that they've evolved to have. So from Charlie's point of view, leaving dead cows was a way of bridging what the way things were and the way things are, so that bear or bears were able to carry out the lives and making a living the way they were evolved to. So he was very logical about things, and that logic came from very careful observation from the perspective of this fitting in philosophy. In terms of intimacy, and again, it was the same type of thing. Charlie would often say, not all bears like me, mm-hmm. and I don't necessarily like all bears. It wasn't that he disliked any bears. It's just like with humans. There's some people you click with, some people you don't click with, etc. But there was always, and he listened. So he didn't go up and shake a bear's hand and say, oh, I want to see you. You look like a beautiful bear, and I want to get to know you. Again, it was like that fitting in. It was being very respectful. He paid attention to when he was walking or in Kamchatka, who was this bear? What was the bear, as much as he could discern, and he really, was very skilled, and he got to know things very well. Where was that bear at? What was he doing, or what was she doing? Was he on his way to fish? Had he just come from? Did he look like he'd just come from kind of having a tussle with another bear? Just like what kind of mood he's in, where is he at? And so that was really, it wasn't so much that was the entree to intimacy, and that's in the sense of, that wasn't Charlie's point. It was his point to show people that, yes, you can have intimate relationships with these giant, awesome bears who could kill you with one swipe, and that they're very gentle and that they're very parsimonious. He did that on purpose in the sense of he wanted to demonstrate that or disprove these myths that have been promulgated by the agencies and, that are now part of our cultural, our cultural myth. So he did want to do that, but on a personal level, that wasn't his agenda. He wanted to get to know his neighbors. I mean, that's the same for me. You know, we have black bears around here. We have cougars, deer, and all sorts of different wildlife, unfortunately diminishing with very low tolerance from people, humans. And we live as neighbors, and that's what I try to cultivate on the land here, that we are guests. You know, my parents bought this cabin 70-some years ago, this little log cabin, and they always taught me, you know, indirectly in the way we were, that we were guests, not only for the wildlife but also for people who had lived in the area before we. So I always grew up with the fact of this is my home. I've spent most of my life here. But I also feel like I don't own it, that I am a guest here still. I mean, that, you know, that the deer we share this together, and we learn each other's ways. And that really brings a very different kind of an atmosphere, and that makes a shift in terms of the animals you encounter.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that makes so much sense. And
we have to. I have to interject this here. Is that the contrary? What Charlie called fear-determined behavior, which is versus fear-informed ways of being. Fear-determined is this notion of scaring off a bear, you know, scaring off a cougar, shooting them, translocating them, acting uptight, making noise. He said, you know, he would talk about, he said, that's the first thing bear is going to say, whoa, what the hell is that? I don't see anything going on. Why is that guy scared? Why is he fearful? So it does this kind of escalation, and it creates that people have talked about a fear landscape or a landscape of fear, not in this way I'm talking about it, but it creates this fearfulness. And that fearfulness has been bred into our culture. Someone made a comment about how, you know, the people that came to North America, I mean, they had gone through so much trauma. Mm-hmm. They've gone through all the plagues. They were serfs. They constantly, fighting with each other, killing each other, and they came here. And they'd wiped out all the wolves, and they'd wiped out all the bears. And that continued here, this fearful mentality. So that is a big part. Charlie was not fearful. What he said is, I'm fear-informed. You know, fear is useful. I mean, it gives you information, but not to be defined by fear.
No. And I think what upset Charlie, and I think many of us, is it's not just a cultural fear, it's an institutionalized fear in the management agencies governing the lives of these grizzlies. And it's a politicized fear because you have all the hype around on grizzly bears as the monsters of God and the wide open-jawed, cover of outdoor life, kinds of things. So it's fear all around. And I think we lose track of how much fear is in the management agencies combined with sort of an arrogance and a disrespect of their topic.
And also, having adverse relationships with wildlife is lucrative. Fishing and hunting and all of that feeds the coffers of the agencies and private enterprise.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so in some regards, it's no wonder that Charlie's work with grizzlies got to be pretty controversial, but it did surprise me because he was always so funny and so well-informed and so low-key. I thought you did a great job describing this aspect of Charlie in your preface, and perhaps you can share that.
When I describe him here, let me see if I can read a couple paragraphs. The preface actually is sort of, trying to frame, let me see here. Okay. I said, what Charlie accomplished takes rare courage, not the kind that held his feet planted in a field of goldenrods as a 600-pound brown bear bore down on him one day in Kamchatka. That was confidence, the kind that began in the heart and grew with intelligence from years of patient learning and caring. Charlie's real courage lay elsewhere. What sets him apart and is truly remarkable is the fortitude with which he weathered social dismissal and outrage for refusing to play humanity's game in favor of revealing nature's reality. His unyielding loyalty to nature and truth was regarded as an unforgivable betrayal. Although the exigencies were often painful and at times even life-threatening, he never wavered. He never forsook his allegiance to nature despite incessant demands and hardship. The contradictions and controversies surrounding Charlie do not derive from the man or the bears, but rather from a human reluctance to do what he did, drop all protective guards of human privilege, and walk unarmed in the terrain of the soul, in the space of stillness from which all life springs.
Yeah, thank you. Well, Charlie's difficulties in some ways got worse or reached a different height when he went to Kamchatka, but he did some remarkable things there. He successfully raised several sets of orphan grizzly bear cubs, serving as their surrogate mom. Maybe you can share some of what he learned and how perhaps that changed your understanding of what perhaps is possible with wild animals.
Well, I think just what I read there sort of is the entree. Again, when Charlie, it was a surprise. That was not part of Plan A, to rescue and reintroduce these orphan brown bears. These were brown bears. He was asked by the zoo, I believe it was directly, if he would take these 3 brown bear cubs. They were orphaned. Their mother had been shot, and then they were sent to the zoo. And they were starting to become bears. They were no longer cute, and children would stick their fingers in and, they start to be more quote-unquote dangerous. So they would be killed if Charlie didn't take them. And I think he saw that as an opportunity. He was also very, part of his genius was that he always was very open to new ideas and new ways of going about things. So he took the bears, and he had to start all over. He had never been. He had seen bear and gotten to know bears, but as a human getting to know bears. And as some of the chapters describe, you can't be a human teaching a bear how to do bear things. Now, he underscored the fact of that, he thought, in fact, he uses this word, I thought I'd be the hero, I teach these bears, and I'm saving them. And he said, actually, they knew a hell of a lot already. Right. But, again, I come from a psychologist perspective, and looking at the development of the brain and the mind and the soul. And Charlie, in order for the bears to really make it as wild bears and to be accepted into wild bear society, they had to learn how to think and feel and all the nuances of wild bear culture in that specific place, which was Kabalnoya Basin. So Charlie himself had to sort of do an internal stripping of any ideas or any kind of what I call shards of human projections or ideas, to be open to hearing and listening and seeing and understanding the world from a bear's point of view. So in some ways, although on the outside he was human, on the inside, in this capacity, he was really bear-like. And that is coming from attachment theory, which is from psychology, which says our brains and our minds are shaped by our primary caregivers, by our caregivers. For elephants, it's a constellation, and more traditional families, when you had more than just a mother and a father and kids, when you had grandparents and aunts, it's that constellation. But Charlie, in the bear society, Charlie was the mother bear, and she's the primary person. Of course, there are the siblings in the environment. So he really had to communicate and be in ways that would inform their brains and minds to be like a bear. And I think, in particular, I've been thinking about it lately, Brandy actually really, I think, was extraordinary. I think she saw this extraordinary person, and I think she was an amazing person, very astute, very deep. And she saw something in Charlie and really respected and cared and loved him for that. And she kind of took him under his wing. And he said he was press ganged. One day she just left her cubs with him. And the cubs were crying and everything like that, and Charlie intuitively fell on his back and, played around, and they all came and, just like a mother bear would. But she basically, this mother bear, who's supposed to be the most dangerous creature on the planet, a bear, right. Mother bear with cubs, just left her cubs with Charlie. And I go into that and kind of analyze it that, he couldn't be just any goober, because even if he's a nice guy, right, he has to be smart enough to know how to navigate the terrain when she's gone. It could be dangerous. So there was so much that she really saw deeply in Charlie. And she mentored him. And, as he talks about very humorously, he was kind of gets goofy with the cubs, and she would make it clear, this is business. I'm fishing. Don't mess with me, So that gives you an idea. And I think it's a very, very important example to reflect on, the depth to which we as humans can sort of melt back into nature. And as Charlie always underscored, he was always amazed, despite the horrible things that people have done to bears over and over and over, even in Kamchatka. The violence and the terrorism that humans subject bears to, they still are very open and loving and caring and curious about humans. That being said, getting back to the original about trauma, is bears are showing, just like other wildlife, they're showing signs of trauma. In other words, they can only take so much. So the bears of, 100 years ago are not the bears of now. Trauma transmits across generations, neurobiologically and socially. And most bears, you can correct me since you guys are the bearologists, but most bears, black or brown, have either been shot at or they've witnessed their mother shot. They've been exposed, if not once, many times. So a lot of times when a bear is killed, and they do the skinning or autopsy or whatever they're doing, they find multiple bullets in the bear that were not lethal. These were prior incidences. So the trauma, so in the shift to understanding bears of who they are, as humans, we have to give them extra time and buffer to start to calibrate to who these new humans are that aren't going to be violent to them. It's just like when we have people who've suffered severe trauma, whether they're veterans or some other kind of violence. Trauma etches in deeply, and it puts you on guard. And it's like, and there's a good reason that bears should be fearful. So all of this, what Charlie showed, is this is totally possible. It's totally within our grasp. But again, the caveat is that while we transition our attitude, learning, we have to make sure that the bears are given wide enough berth that they can start to sort of decompress from the trauma that they've been subjected to.
Yeah, so giving bears a wide enough berth is also becoming much more important as a result of climate change. In and around Yellowstone and Glacier, we've been seeing climate change essentially force grizzlies to forage much more widely as a result of the loss of key foods like whitebark pine seeds. So climate change is underscoring the need for an even higher degree of human tolerance and compassion as grizzlies seek to compensate for the loss of some critically important native foods.
Yes. So, what we're talking about, and right now is a perfect time. We can see the changes in animals with the quarantining. All over the world is reports of essentially animals coming back out feeling confidence again. They're no longer feeling so beleaguered. And we should pay attention to that and understand about how much stress that animals are having to sustain just because we want to do what we want to do. So there should not be, the other thing is that, that Charlie talked about, and I believe that, in other places as well, is that when you go out into nature, again, it's like going into someone's home. You be respectful. and not have the objective and feel the entitlement of I want to see a bear, I want to see a bison. That's not a human right. And so again, this is human entitlement and human primacy, and that the nature and animals are more important. They're more important in numbers. Of course, they're diminishing, but I also believe that when we make those changes internally, when we, subordinate our ego, when we start to listen, when we see that we're not that important, what is important is, a philosophy of getting along and respecting, and as much as we can, each of us go without and not be demanding, that has a positive effect on us as humans and our relationships with each other. So, the violence that we see is this because we're untethered, rather than we're untethered because we're not fitting in.
Yeah.
And that's a big lesson.
Yeah. And there's a disturbing ethos. It's not just I want a picture of a bear. It's like nature is a trophy. Even if you may not be gunning them down or putting their head on a wall, you see nature, people even come to the park, see nature as trophy, things on the checklist, which is a form of sort of arrogance and dominance, even if people aren't killing them.
Yes.
Yeah. Okay, you exposed Charlie to the work of the physicist David Bohm, who was a colleague of Albert Einstein, and whose ideas about quantum physics inspired both of you. Maybe you can share how that work is relevant to caring for this planet and the animals.
Well, this tells you a little bit about Charlie. When we worked together for a long time, and we're writing different versions, and I explained in that chapter about how that we had accomplished half of what we wanted. We explained that, from the neuropsychology, the stuff and everything, we explained part of that basically what we did was we said all these myths about grizzly bears being maniacs, being unpredictable, et cetera, were false. And we showed that with the science. And but that was only half of what we wanted, because the other half was really, how does Charlie see what he sees, and how does he do what he does, and why? So essentially we were looking for a way to articulate in collective terms Charlie's theory of nature. And I had studied in the past physics. That was my background in physics and mathematics largely, and quantum physics. I'm not a quantum physicist. I very know it superficially, but I have a couple of colleagues who are theoretical physicists, quantum physicists. And so I just kind of went, and I showed this video interview of David Bohm, who was a quantum physicist. He was the heir apparent of Albert Einstein. And I showed it to Charlie, and he called me up immediately, said, oh, my God, I feel like I've found my lost brother. He was like a soulmate in terms of hearing the way David Bohm described life in the world was very much the same way that Charlie experienced it. So when you look at quantum physics is organic to the Western science paradigm, what we would call the colonial paradigm. But what it does is it basically has changed it all. It was a paradigm buster. Everything that we look at, which is based on classical mechanics, and reductionism and dualism, et cetera, quantum mechanics said, no, that's not the way the world works. That's not the way things are. There's this notion of oneness, et cetera. Now, quantum mechanics, really, that happened over 100 years ago, and it continues to be developed, et cetera. But the majority, by far, quantum mechanics has been stuffed into the same political, economic, social agenda. So it's been reduced into reductionism, to make faster computers and safer money and things like that. David Bohm was very unusual in the sense that he took the message, the philosophical, the profound existential message to the streets. And that message was really resonated with Charlie. and even in the sense of the way, that they had personal experiences were very similar. So that was also, it was very important that Charlie was not, quote unquote, just a bear guy, in the sense of, and this is also about the bears. Bears are not just bears. It has to do with really understanding these beings, Charlie and the bears and other wildlife, as having particular metaphysical and philosophical views which are resonant with quantum physics.
Well, Gay, how does your long work with Charlie inform your evolving views about animal sentience and animal welfare?
Well, I would say writing the book, I wrote the book de novo after Charlie passed, and it was a real crucible for me because I felt this incredible, we got to the point where, I'd send things back and forth, and he'd say, did I say that, or did you write that? So I had full confidence, and close family and friends agreed that I was worthy and had the ability to be able to convey Charlie faithfully. That was very, very important for me ethically, as well as the bears. But it was a crucible for me. It was as many people felt, his loss was huge. And really I had to do a lot of what I call internal work. I would even look up words that I would just normally use, just to make sure that I was using them in the context that was really true. And so having that precision and accuracy was very important. And I had to really do internal work to make sure I was like kind of a clear channel, that I was not, although we were very much overlapping in our philosophies and ideas and nonetheless, this was really a vehicle for hearing Charlie and the bears' philosophy and science. That's what it was. So I wouldn't say, I guess I said, back to your question, that was kind of a preface to it, is that that's still working me in depth. I'm teaching a class on the book because there's a lot to reflect on, and there's much deeper, there's a lot of deeper things and underneath many layers in Charlie's teachings and his reflections. And it's made me even more committed to the truth. I guess that's what it is it just sort of burned out any kind of, I don't know what you want to call it, any kind of social, pressure or social, leanings to kind of soften the message. It's really sort of really kind of cleaned me down to the bare truth and how to communicate that in the most effective way for the animals. So it has made me just what I wrote when that first passage, where become more, not deviate from the fidelity with nature, the way Charlie never deviated from his fidelity with nature. And I bring that into my work with, we have a sanctuary and the wildlife that we try to support here under these very difficult times. And that changes you when you no longer are having a split allegiance between the human agenda, the dominant human agenda, and those of the animals. It changes you. And that's basically what I've done, is that shedding, and that requires, we have a little tagline, be who animals need us to be. And that is who they need us to be. They need us to be honest, and they need us to clean up our own internal act, our projections, our ego, all that kind of stuff, because they're very honest, and they're very real, and they're very true. And so that's had an effect on me. We have many animals right now just because of their ages and the abuses they suffered are catching up. And so a large part of my work is hospice work, and that means really being present where they're at. And so I guess that's kind of a long-winded way to say that's kind of what one of the effects of this work has had on me in my personal life.
Wow. Thank you for your work. I should throw one thing parenthetically in here, given listeners who go to bear country. Charlie was really all about safety in bear country. He got really close to bears. He understood bears. He was very safe. He never carried a gun. He carried bear spray, but he only had to use it a few times to protect his cubs from other male bears that he feared would kill him. Charlie was really all about safety and discernment in bear country. He had electric fence around his cabin, and he could do things because he was so in tune with bears and behavior and what they needed, and and he was part bear, but not to understate that he was not silly out there either.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I've got one last question about your take on the future. We obviously have been talking about a planet in peril and wildlife that have never been so imperiled by humankind, through pollution and development and intolerance and killing and climate change and elders. What do you think it's going to take to turn things around if we still can?
I think it takes internal transformation and a commitment the way Charlie did. And it means putting nature first before ourselves. I mean, obviously we have to live, but that having that fidelity to nature and just learning to put our own ego down and our needs. It might even be financial. It might be social. I mean, definitely when you talk to people in the animal rights movement or vegan or whatever, they talk about the social tensions, that to break the human-human contract, that's where tensions are, because that's maintaining a certain, cultural contract. That's gone. That was never there. That's the artificial world that was created. Our job right now is learning how to live nature reality the way Charlie did. Charlie was very practical, and as you said, in terms of this parenthetical, he wasn't dumb. I mean, he spent years learning to live with nature and fitting in. And so, and as we talked about, the trauma that animals have suffered, that cougars have suffered and bears, for example, and they don't have food. They have people all over, making noise. There's roads. That's incredibly disruptive. We have to understand that they have souls and minds, and they are traumatized. And we have to learn to go quietly, and we have to learn to recede, give back nature. We're not managing them. We need to manage ourselves, and we need to refrain and restrain. We have a perfect opportunity right now to make a radical change in our culture, and that radical change is to devote ourselves to nature's wellness and putting ourselves second to nature.
Well, thank you, Gay. Thank you so much for joining us today. This is Louisa Wilcox with Dr. Gay Bradshaw at Grizzly Times. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
You can also listen to a really fun interview that I did with Charlie Russell in 2016 on grizzlytimespodcast.org, episodes 5 and 6. If you want to learn more about the grizzly and what you can do to help, subscribe to our newsletter at grizzlytimespodcast.org. And if you can, give us a review.